Hi again, and welcome to our read aloud of the split history of westward expansion. We are continuing to focus on different perspectives when we read. When reading In the Native American Perspective, Chapter 1, we read about how white settlers, in order to have better lives, moved onto Native American lands. But instead of living peacefully together, the Native Americans began to be pushed off their lands by the growing number of settlers moving west. Today I will pause to jot down some ideas that make me wonder about the events taking place, to question the text, and to understand that while the settlers may have been fulfilling their dreams of better lives, that the Native Americans might just have been facing nightmares. Chapter 2, Troubles in the East and West. The U.S. government continued its push westward. The goal was for the West to be settled by families who would turn the land into profitable farms, ranches, and towns. Government leaders wanted the western half of the United States to resemble the East. The American Indians watched the changes that were happening around them in dismay. They knew their way of life would never be the same. The Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Seminole tribes lived in the southeastern United States. They were known as the 5 civilized tribes because they had assimilated in many ways with their white neighbors, including becoming farmers, establishing towns, and learning to read or write. In general, they got along well with the settlers, but that began to change as the demand for land grew. So I'm going to pause here to think about my reading, and I have one general question. Well, if these were 5 civilized tribes and they had assimilated or become like their white neighbors, which meant that they were farmers and the towns were already established, then why did white settlers think that it was okay just to move in on their land and push them off? If that's what the goal was for the United States, was to turn the western part into the eastern part with profitable farms, ranches, and towns, they might have had a head start because the Native Americans already did some of the legwork for them. So I wonder why they weren't treated equally. Moving on. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which allowed the federal government to relocate American Indians who lived east of the Mississippi, including the 5 civilized tribes. Tribes that signed the government treaties would have to move west of the Mississippi River to an area called Indian Territory. Indian Territory was located in present-day Oklahoma, more than 1,000 miles from the tribal homelands. Under the terms of the Indian Removal Act, the tribes were supposed to be allowed to make their own decisions about relocating. The Choctaw and the Chickasaw chose to sign treaties and move. The Creek signed a treaty that would allow them to stay in Alabama while giving up a large part of their land to settlers. The Creek soon lost their land to the settlers, and in 1836 they were forced to move west. While a few members of the Seminole and Cherokee tribes had signed removal treaties, most tribe members wanted to stay and declared the treaties invalid. The Seminoles went to war 3 times in an effort to keep their land in Florida, but by the early 1840s, most had left and moved west. At this point, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to wonder what those Native American members were feeling at that time when the government told them that they had to move. I think I would have felt anger that somebody was telling me that I had to leave the lands that my family had lived on for generations, the land that I had grew up on, and the land that I worked to be successful. I think I would also feel that I would want to stay and fight for what is mine. I can understand why some people would want to follow the law because it was the government, and you're supposed to follow rules. But the rules were changing. And even though from a settler's perspective this was great, we were gaining more land so that we could become prosperous, the Native Americans were being forced off their lands, and it wasn't fair. I also wonder why the two groups of people couldn't work together. They were both interested in being prosperous, having farmland and building towns and creating prosperous areas for the United States. So I wonder what made them not be able to work together. Trail of Tears. The Cherokee decided to use the legal system to try to keep their land. In 1831, the tribe sued the state of Georgia. The state had passed a law in 1830 outlawing whites from living on Indian land, which was aimed at white missionaries who were helping the Cherokee. The case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which ruled in the Cherokee's favor. But President Andrew Jackson would not enforce the ruling. In 1836, the government gave the Cherokee 2 years to pack up and leave. Most refused. In 1838, the government sent in 7,000 soldiers to force the Cherokee to leave. About 15,000 men, women, and children began walking 1,200 miles from Georgia to Indian Territory. Along the way, about 4,000 died of exposure, starvation, and disease. Cherokees still remember it as the Trail of Tears. Again, I have to question the text at this point, because even when some people tried to help, like the U.S. Supreme Court, there were others who were really intent on moving Native Americans out of their land for white settlers. I wonder if any of them remembered back to the time where Great Britain was telling them what to do and they didn't like it, and they stood up and fought for their independence from what they called a tyrant. So I don't blame the Cherokee for wanting to stand up and fight for their land. But when it says the government sent in 7,000 soldiers to force them to leave, I think that was unfair. Because once again, thinking about when King George sent all those British military members to the United States to tell the American colonists what to do, they seem to have forgotten about that. We're going to move forward a few paragraphs. Many Americans supported the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that white Americans were meant to own all of the land from coast to coast because that is what God wanted. They saw nothing wrong with taking any land they wanted, even land occupied by American Indians. As the white population slowly inched its way west, Indians had to either fight to hold on to their land or leave. Fighting among Indian tribes over territory or other issues was not unusual. The lack of unity among the tribes weakened the Indians as they fought westward expansion. Another advantage for the army and the settlers was that almost everyone spoke the same language, English, while the Indians didn't. With various tribes living all over the country, gaps in communication made coming together as a united force against the settlers and the army almost impossible. As I pause here, again I wonder if those settlers remembered all those years of fighting the Great Britain and King George over taxes and the inability to live their life as they wanted to live it. And now they turned around and they're acting just like King George and the Great Britain military. I could understand the Native Americans wanting to fight because it was their land. They had been on it, they have lived on it for generations, and when somebody came to tell them that they had to move, it just wasn't understandable for them. I understand that the settlers wanted better lives, but they could have lived side by side and had prosperous farms. They didn't have to take something that wasn't theirs. Their fighting methods also hampered the American Indian tribes. Depending on the tribe, Indian warriors were skilled fighters with knives, lances, and bows and arrows. The Indians believed that the closer you were to your enemy, the greater and more honorable the victory. The soldiers and the settlers fought back with guns, which were deadly at long distances. When the Indians did choose to fight, they often fought alone or in small groups. They attacked settlers on their way west or single families on their homesteads, stealing horses and burning down houses, farms, and crops. Fear of Indian attacks and of Indians grew amongst the settlers. So here I wonder if the Native Americans were able to be brought together as one whole group, similar to the American military, would they have had a chance? Instead of fighting in small groups or alone, and with lesser weapons than the American military, would they have won if they were able to band together, work together as larger numbers? I don't know if I'll ever find the answer to that, but it's just a wonder that I have, a question that I have when reading. If they were able to work together, would history be a little different? And would the settlers have more of a nightmare instead of the Native Americans? So when you're reading, make sure you look at both sides of the story. There's always different perspectives, whether it be in fiction or nonfiction. Just make sure you're fair and you're looking for evidence to support both sides.